Thank you for stopping by the War Den. When I started researching the Dachau liberation reprisals, I had no idea the rabbit hole I'd go down. I looked for, and was surprised I couldn't find a video actually identifying the individual Germans executed by hanging May 28 and 29, 1946 at Landsberg, Germany, as a result of the Dachau war crimes trial. I've colorized all black and white footage. After painstakingly researching the Dachau concentration camp for the past 2 to 3 months, I finally identified the Germans in 30 different hanging executions. It's an interesting cast of 40 characters, including commandants, camp doctors, guards, administrators and capos, all prisoners who acted as employees of the camp. This video shows the horrific living conditions at Dachau, followed by scenes from Dachau's liberation, including a young Brigadier General Felix Sparks. I've colorized and translated into English the actual Dachau war crimes trial. After the trial, we'll see all of the hanging executions, along with scenes from the trial giving detailed descriptions of the human medical experiments performed at Dachau. A cautionary tale. Not for the faint of heart. Thank you for joining us at the War Den today, as we find out what the Dachau concentration camp was really like in April of 1945.
And I remember I was laying down, this guy says, "Oh my God, what a sight." A sight. They start picking up the people. They picked them up one by one. Most of them were dead because they couldn't, that one. And the less they were alive, they put them in trucks and jeeps, and they took them to hospitals, or they made tents, and they put them in, they gave them water, they gave them packets from the Red Cross. And this was bad too, because people, when they got those packages, there was powder milk, there was chocolate, there was a can of meat, and they were so hungry they didn't care, and they ate it. So hundreds died from eating this stuff because their stomach was no use to food. And I had a guy next to me, I don't know if he was a doctor once or something, he was half dead too. When he got that package, and I think he was Hungarian or Romanian, he says to me, "Don't eat nothing, don't eat nothing. If you're gonna eat anything, you're gonna die. The only thing you do, if you have sugar, take the sugar on the mouth and suck on the sugar. It's the only thing you should do." He says, "The rest of them throw away. And if you want to keep it, but don't eat anything. Don't take the milk in your mouth, don't take the chocolate, don't take the meat," because they used to give you a can of meat, Spam. "Don't eat it, because if you're going to eat it, you're going to die." And that's what happened. Those people, they eat the stuff. They got diarrhea and they died.
Now, though, he's got his view of Dachau. Roll number 4, SPX Germany, Dachau concentration camp, Mr. Dortheimer. Yes, you were telling me about your feelings about the future.
Our future is a question about what we have not in picture now. Since in Europe have been killed, I think I now 7 to 8 million Jews. Since in the concentration camps of Auschwitz, there have been 4 stove and gas cameras with a production of 35 to 40,000 deaths a day. In Treblinka, in Belzec, and other places, been stoves with gas cameras there have been killed every day 10 to 15,000 men. We are more than sure that nobody lives from our families. Only this few men which are here. So we are now without homes. Our homes we are spread out from our homes in Poland as the ghettos have been made, and then we have been put out from the ghettos and taken to the concentration camps. Now the problem, every other nation can go home. They know the addresses, they know that there is somebody waiting on there, the family, the wives, the fathers, the children, and we don't know what will be now with us. We have no place to go back. We are as beggars without home, without anything. And we hope that the light government will do something to help us to find new homes for us, to find a way for us that we can come up once more, and that we shall be the arms from the arms in the world.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Baum, if you just stay with us a minute, Mr. Arnold. How long have you been here?
I've been here 2 years and a half.
You were just relating a moment ago something of particular interest, I think, to us about your treatment here in the camp. How has it been?
My
Tell us your
treatment.
story.
I've been arrested in November 42 in France. I was in a political organization and I was arrested on the demarcation line under suspicion from espionage. There I've been put in prison, and afterwards I went to Belgium, in Brussels. After 2 months imprisonment in Brussels, I came here in Dachau. In Dachau, I had the luck that I came with my false name, and I had a better position than the other one, because I'm good speaking German, also several languages, because I'm medical student. And I had employment, and afterwards I was in the staff of the camp. But if I would be discovered like a Jew, probably long I was killed.
You say they did not know that you were Jewish. Would your treatment have been different if they discovered that from your treatment as the ordinary political prisoner?
My treatment...
Would your treatment at the hands of the SS who were running the camp have been different if they'd known your Jewish faith?
Surely.
How different?
How different they... I was sent to crematorium if they discovered that I was Jew.
You'd have been sent to crematorium.
Or shot, or killed, or hanged.
Why don't you didn't make this fact known until such time the American soldiers were over here?
Only till the American soldiers were here.
That's good.
Stop. You know, sir.
I have been arrested 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago. SPX Germany, roll number 4, Dachau concentration camp, Michelet and Nauvoo.
Mister, are you a Frenchman?
I am Frenchman, yes.
Tell us a little bit about your experience. I'd like to know how long you've been here, why you came here, and so forth.
I am one of the first who erected resistance in France. I have been arrested end of January 1943. So I am here since nearly 2 years. I stay 6 months in prison of Rennes in Paris, 1 month in the dreadful camp of Saarbrück, where I saw some dreadful things, and I arrived here in September 43. Then the camp was not so hard than it was before, but nevertheless, I saw really here dreadful things too.
For instance?
Yes. For instance, well, 10 days before I came here, we had to stay nearly 36 hours at the place to spend the good pleasure of our SS, our Boro. For instance, 36 hours.
try that. Nothing to do. It was quite strictly forbidden to go anywhere, to do anything. You see? Now what I want to tell you is that last July of one French convoy of 2,000 Frenchmen, political Frenchmen, in this train, more than the half have been killed in the train. Quite killed, you know. That's what we call in French the convoi de la mort, the death convoy.
Very much like this train that arrived at Dachau here last
exactly,
week.
Yes. Last month of July, it was so for 1,000 Frenchmen.
What do you believe caused those deaths?
Treatment from the SS, there were 100 in the wagons, you know, with 30 degrees temperature.
Did many Frenchmen come?
No water since Commandant till Dachau. During 6 days, no water, not a drop of water. It was quite wonderful.
How many men came with you to imprisonment at the time?
Oh, when I was arrested, it was the first I told you.
Yeah.
It was then the beginning of important resistance, you see. It was only the beginning. But when, a few months later, so it was not important.
To what do you owe the fact you believe that you are alive now, that you didn't perish like
To the Providence. To the Providence.
Providence.
I am a Roman Catholic, and I do believe in God, you know. I am obliged to believe in God.
Well, thank you.
To the Providence.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's
Germany, Dachau concentration camp, Professor Popovich, Yugoslavia.
Professor Popovich, will you tell us who you are, a little bit about yourself, and also tell us about Dachau?
I am a BA of the University of Cambridge, a doctorate of philosophy of the University of London, and a professor of English in the University of Belgrade. I was put in prison by the German authorities as soon as they arrived to Belgrade. The reason for my arrest was that I was an Anglophile. I was actually, before the war, General Secretary of the Society of Friends of Great Britain and America in Yugoslavia, and the co-editor of an Anglophile periodical called Danica. The Germans thought that that was a sufficient reason that I should be sent into concentration camp. Before I was sent to the concentration camp, I was told by a German official, you are a university professor. Well, a university professor to be so stupid as to be a friend of the Anglo-American nations deserves to be sent to Dachau to improve his intelligence. And he was very pleased with his joke. Then I was sent to Dachau, and I've been here about 4 years, a little bit less than 4 years. And the first days when I arrived, one of the taskmasters in Dachau said to me, I gather you are a university professor and somewhat lame owing to a wound which you received in the previous war. Well, exactly such people I need to work in my detachment. And he sent me immediately with a number of aged people to carry heavy stones and sacks with cement to masons who were building a huge edifice outside the camp. You may imagine what we suffered, and I particularly with my old wound, but nevertheless we were able to endure that because we had still some energy. And then I got an easier job after that. They gave me to make wooden spoons. For several months I made that. Then I lost that job. Then I was sent to do some heavy field works outside the camp. We were driven by blows to work during the heavy rains. And we worked from about 5 o'clock a.m. bis 7 o'clock p.m.
with a short break of half an hour for lunch, which consisted of a thin potato soup. And
Dachau, factory of horrors. Dachau, near München, one of the oldest of the Nazi prison camps. It is known that from 1941 to 1944, up to 30,000 people were entombed here at one time, and 30,000 were present when the Allies reached Dachau. The Nazis said it was a prison for political dissenters, habitual criminals, and religious enthusiasts.
aux délégations représentées, au nom des juifs des différents pays assemblés ici, au nom des noms morts qui ont dû...
When these scenes were filmed, over 1,600 priests, representing many denominations, still remained alive. They came from Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, and Holland. Incoming prison trains arrived, carrying more dead than living. Those strong enough to travel were brought to Dachau from outlying points which were threatened by the Allied advance. This is how they looked when they arrived. Some survived, and when the rescuers arrived, they administered what aid they could. Others died after the liberation. They were buried by their fellow prisoners. As in the case of other camps, local townspeople were brought in to view the dead at Dachau. This is what the liberators found inside the buildings. Hanging in orderly rows were the clothes of prisoners who had been suffocated in a lethal gas chamber. They had been persuaded to remove their clothing under the pretext of taking a shower, for which towels and soap were provided. This is the Brausbad, the shower bath. Inside the shower bath, the gas vents. On the ceiling, the dummy shower heads. In the engineer's room, the intake and outlet pipes. Push buttons to control inflow and outtake of gas. A hand valve to regulate pressure. Cyanide powder was used to generate the lethal smoke. From the gas chamber, the bodies were removed to the crematory. Here is what the camera crew found inside.
They told us, the court told us, that we would be treated as political prisoners. But they put us in that camp among burglars and thieves, German burglars and thieves, and they were our capos, our commandos in work. And we were, in the beginning, we were beaten very hard, and later on we had to be very careful not to be put in the punishment company. I have been in the punishment company. I had to carry on the hill, in the mountain, a very heavy box where they put in the bread every day, 6 weeks long, and after that, rolling big stones the whole way. Only the help of a young friend of mine saved me from dying.
SPX Germany. Dachau concentration camp, Dr. Husserek.
Dr. Husserek, you Dr. Paul Gies? I am. Yes. And your nationality is? Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia. And how long have you been here in Dachau?
For nearly 5 years.
For nearly 5 years?
Yes.
What brought you here, Doctor?
I was brought here by the Prague Gestapo because I was under suspicion to have with different countries literary and social and political connections.
What kind of a trial did you have before you were confined here?
I had no trial in my life.
Who have you been able to appeal to gain liberty from this case? Who have you been able to state your case to?
No, I wouldn't have got a trial because I felt entirely unguilty.
I see. Since you've been in Dachau, the conditions around here are obvious. But since you've been in Dachau, have you been subjected to any forms of punishment outside of the living conditions and the general order depravity that we see here?
Yes. From the first day when I arrived, I had to work heavily in a working group to carry stones and to shovel earth. And one day I was accused for insufficient labor, and for that I got a punishment which lasted 1 hour, and the punishment was that I was put up with my chained hand behind the back on a wooden boom who was between 2 pillars in the shower bars of the camp. And there I was left. I was hanging for 1 hour with nearly 35 other fellow prisoners. Many of them lost their conscience during this execution, and when they lost their conscience, so a man had to put a pail of cold water over them that they may regain their conscience. And in this condition we were for exactly 1 hour, then we were put down to the ground, and our arms were unchained, but we were unable, most of us, to elevate our arms for buttoning our coat. And so I had to plead a fellow to button my coat, to go out and back to the barrack where we lived. And for 3 or 4 days, most of us has been unable to take a spoon in the hand because we have been so weak by that torture. And so we had have had to be fed by our fellow prisoners. We were unable to take our own meals. And many of us had for a couple of weeks lamed arms as a consequence of this torture. This torture took place nearly 4 or 5 times a month in a number of 40 to 50 persons.
What other form of punishment were commonly in use here about Dr. Usrek?
What form of...
What's this business I hear referred to about the 25 lashes?
The 25 lashes, it was another sort of punishment. A fellow prisoner accused for a trifle or for organizing some food or stuff because we have all been hungry. He was punished to bend over a table, and there he was binded with a leather belt, and then he was slapped by 2 SS men, every minute 1 slap on his backside. And ordinarily he had to count the slaps. And when he arrived, for instance, 20, so one of these SS men said, "Oh, you are a mistake, it's 18. So we will begin again. And so he got, instead of the 25, he got 40 and 50 and 70 slaps.
Tell me some other things about Dachau, Doctor.
And in my working group, it was the Commando Waffen-SS, where I had to work. There was a young German painter who was heartsick because he couldn't work as it was demanded from him. So the leader of the working group sent him to jump into a brook which was passing nearby. It was on a cold, rainy and snowy April day of 41. And when he was entirely wet, he ordered him to come out, and then he had to stay for 3 hours, from 2 o'clock in the afternoon till 5 o'clock, on a scaffolding 2 meters above the ground, in attention. At 5 o'clock, he fell down from that scaffolding, entirely exhausted. At 5:30, we took him up and carried him into the camp and delivered him to the hospital, where he died in the following night.
Thank you, Doctor. How did you manage to become accustomed to living with so many dead people as I've seen around here? I noticed in the courtyards and in the lavatories and latrines in the morning.
Yes, we saw so many atrocities and brutalities and things to which no normal man is accustomed, that in the course of the years we are here now, most of us lost a sentiment for that. That doesn't mean that we got the same brutes as the responsible men who did that, but to keep ourselves alive. So we had to become hard and to become very well disciplined, otherwise we would have suffered the same fate.
Yeah, I understand how you feel. In the few days that I've been around here, the death rate is so great with so many people expiring and being put out to be carried away that one becomes accustomed to seeing death. And
it's the only way to go on with living here in the camp, because the average time of every prisoner in a concentration camp is statistically only 2 years.
See, you shall go out with joy. As our Tanakh beautifully puts it, you shall go out with joy, their hands, and instead of
when something goes in. Yes. Yes. Now, in others, he can't here stay.
Roll number 2, XTX Germany. Dachau concentration camp, Dr. Couchet.
Now, Mr. Cusi, you are... Cucci, yes, thank you. You are the ex-information minister from Albania.
Well, I am an ancient Albanian newspaperman who was the editor-in-chief of some Albanian political newspapers, and in the latest times I was the editor-in-chief of the Albanian Review, which was called The Nation. I can give you just a short view of the aims of this review. This was the leading review against the Italian politics in Albania. And in the last days of my country, that is before 1939, I led the Albanian propaganda, the Albanian press.
Well, that brought you into conflict with the Italian invader at that time, I suppose.
Yes.
And eventually led you to this situation that you were in here a week ago.
Yes. Well, the Italians invaded my country, as you know, in 1939, in the 7th of April. And immediately when they were in, they got a lot of the Albanian political factors, and they sent in different places of Italia. And it was exactly on this time, and I remember it now, on the 11th of April, that I myself was arrested and sent in places of Italia, where I passed about 4.5 years.
4.5 years in confinement in the hands of the SS.
In the hands of the fascist policy.
Fascist policy.
Italian fascist policy.
What brought you to this SS camp?
Well, after the Italian capitulation, I returned in Tirana. And there, of course, the Germans had then occupied my country. And the Germans tried to build an Albanian government. And as soon as I was found in Tirana, they, whose methods and means all the world knows, were in this moment trying to build a formal Albanian government that would justify in some way all what they would do in Albania. And as soon as I arrived in Tirana, of course, the Germans asked me to take in my hands the Ministry of Culture and Propaganda. Of course, I refused. And it is the reason which led me to this camp. First to the prison of Vienna, and then to the camp of Dachau. I suppose it will be very interesting for the world to say something about the prison of Vienna, where I passed about 7 months.
Well, we've seen this last week since we've been here. We've seen a good deal of Dachau. I wish you'd tell us a little bit about your experience here in the camp.
Well, I arrived here about 12 months ago, and when I arrived here, of course, I found the camp in a very great fever of hope for the Allied victory, because all knew then that the German nation had come to its end.
Can I interrupt you just 1 second, Doctor? What would have been the hope of the people in the camp if the Allies had not carried the war on to as far as this camp for an actual liberation? What would your hope for the future be?
Death, total death.
Parole, escape, time off for good conduct?
Only those who were usually during this war named the Quislings of Europe would most probably in the next time, if they would serve well their master, might have some possibilities of living. But for the rest, for those who were against, it was immediate death. for the rest of the masses, it was a long starvation and the epilogue at the
Tell us something about your life while you've been here in this camp.
Well, I may only relate you an instance of my life here in the camp, and that was in the winter, in the last winter. I was got by a very strong fever because I was suffering when I came here in this camp from lungs, and I have a pneumothorax. I got cold and I had a very strong fever, and this fever led me to some people and some friends who interfered that I might be taken in the TBC station of Dachau. I went there. The way in which they received the people here in the dispensary of Dachau was this. All the people who would have been received every evening were taken to the bathroom, which is about 500 meters from in the dispensary. There they would bathe, they were undressed, was given to them a shirt, and only with this shirt, and some barefooted, and some with wood shoes, were led from the bath to the dispensary. You should not forget, of course, that it was winter and it was about 25 degrees below zero. So the people went to the dispensary. They got there, of course, a bed and one cover. They suffered for about 2 weeks, and after 2 weeks, the people, the responsible people of dispensary, gave them, in addition to their shirts, also a pair of trousers. And in this shirt and in these trousers, they would have to stay there for the period until they were recovered. I saw some hundreds of people who died, because you know that last autumn arrived here all the people of the camp of Natzweiler, and these people arrived in very bad conditions, and a very great part of them was, of course, has here in Dachau died. The cures that were given in the dispensary were very poor. No medicaments, no special cures, how I can say it. The doctor was, of course, obliged to come there because the doctor was a prisoner, usually, and he was obliged to come there and give courage to the different peoples, but only with wars. You know that the SS people made all what was possible, that in the dispensary of Dachau doesn't exist medicaments.
General Lenz. Die Angeklagten, 40 Personen, meist Angehörige der SS. Die Anklage, Grausamkeiten, Misshandlungen, Tötungen, Prügelungen, Folterungen, Verhungerungen, tätliche Übergriffe und Erniedrigungen, begangen an Zivilpersonen und alliierten Kriegsgefangenen. Ferner die Durchführung unmenschlicher medizinischer Experimente an hilflosen Lagerinsassen. Nummer 1, der Kommandant des Lagers, Martin Gottfried Weiss. Nummer 3, Josef Jarolin. Er gab zu, den Befehl zum Erschießen von 700 Häftlingen gegeben zu haben. Nummer 15, der Arzt Dr. Klaus Karl Schilling. Er verschuldete durch medizinische Experimente den Tod von etwa 3000 Häftlingen. Nummer 27. Fritz Becher wurde als einer der größten Sadisten im Lager bezeichnet. Ein Zeuge wird vereidigt. Der Zeuge identifiziert einen der Beschuldigten. Als weiterer Zeuge tritt Prinz Friedrich Leopold von Preußen auf, der selbst Häftling in Dachau war. Der Verteidiger spricht. In der Verhandlungspause werden die Angeklagten zum Mittagessen geführt. Der frühere Lagerkommandant Weiss. Dr. Schilling sträubt sich gegen die Aufnahme. Dr. Schilling sträubt sich gegen die Aufnahme. Der Tag der Urteilsverkündung. 36 von den 40 Angeklagten werden zum Tode durch den Strang verurteilt. Die anderen erhalten Zuchthausstrafen. Jeder Urteilsspruch wird durch einen Dolmetscher übersetzt.
Friedrich Wilhelm Rupert. The court in closed session, at least 2/3 of the members present at the time the vote was taken concurring, sentences you to death by hanging at such time and place as higher authority may direct.
Das Gericht hat nach Beratung und unter Zustimmung von mindestens 2/3 der bei der Abstimmung anwesenden Mitglieder auf die folgende Strafe erkannt. Der Angeklagte wird zum Tode durch Erhängen verurteilt. Zeit und Ort für die Vollziehung der Todesstrafe werden von der höheren Militärbehörde bestimmt werden.
Jeder der Angeklagten tritt vor und nimmt sein Urteil entgegen. Angeklagten, so führte der Anklagevertreter in seiner Schlussrede aus, haben alle das Recht verwirkt, in der menschlichen Gesellschaft zu leben. Das Todesurteil ist notwendig, damit die Welt erfahre, dass nie wieder solche Verbrechen geduldet werden.
SS people made all what was possible that in the dispensary of Dachau doesn't exist medicaments, and the dispensary was not other but a trying place for long years.
I understand that from what I've seen. Well, thank you, Dr. But you want to,
Well, as you know, here in Dachau exists today an international prisoners committee, and of course the activity of this committee goes at about 7 or 8 months before. Before the arrival of the American troops, we were obliged to work underground, and we worked and carried on our work until on the 28th of the last month. On the 28th, about 20 hours before the American troops arrived in this camp, we got the reins of the camp in our hands. In this case, I, a member of the committee and in charge for the information and press of the camp, I want to send a little message in the name of the committee to our liberators. In these moments of extreme joy and universal jubilee, my mind flies over the seas to the formidable and marvelous people of the United States who so much contributed for the world's liberty and for our freedom. It is with the help of the noble and generous blood of the American soldiers that Europe won its liberty and that the new, the right history of the world will find its way. To this people, so rich in traditions of liberty and democratical principles, I, in the name of the International Prisoners Committee of Dachau, sent my best greetings. What they did for us, we know, and only today that the Hitlerian beast is at its knees confessing the innumerable crimes and the enormous tortures that the sinistrous mind of Himmler could ever create, only now we can plainly...
Flying fortress.
Only now we can plainly realize the formidable work of the American friends. Long live the Allied glorious armies. Long live America.
Thank you.
I recall having nailed up the sign, Headquarters, 3rd United States Army War Crimes Trials, Dachau. We decided that we were going to have the trials in Dachau. Now, Dachau was liberated by the 7th Army, not the 3rd Army. But we were occupying, General Patton was there, and that was the situs where we were going to have trials. And so we took these Army officers who'd been assigned to the Judge Advocate section, not because they were lawyers, but because they were at liberty, and we needed staff, and they had nobody else, and they were going to set up tribunals. These were, in fact, military tribunals. They're not to be confused with what happened later at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which was an international court. These were military-style tribunals which have existed under the laws of war for a very long time. And they were staffed by military officers, similar to a court-martial. It followed the court-martial procedure. So they would have 3 officers, a colonel, a major, a captain, or whatever. The highest ranking was the presiding officer. The prosecutors were selected by the Judge Advocate group. They may or may not have been lawyers. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. They were a lieutenant assigned to defend so-and-so or to prosecute so-and-so as they would a soldier who'd gone AWOL. And then they had all these nice reports prepared by me, by Nowitz, by a few other guys. Slotnick was another lawyer who came on board, and we had a fellow named Briggs who was a lawyer, went up to Boston. All these were enlisted men, and they did all the work. And they'd have these reports, and based on those reports, we would draw up the indictment. I would draw up the indictment, and the indictment would say that SS Major so-and-so is indicted for mass murder of so many concentration camp inmates in such and such camp during such and such period when he was in command. And the evidence is photographs obtained by the Signal Corps, statements from the survivors, my own affidavit or other affidavits of witnesses who were there, usually not my own. I would certify to the procedures whereby these affidavits were obtained. And on the basis of that, the defendant would be asked, how do you plead? And they'd say, I plead not guilty. All right, let's proceed with the trial.
Defendants were not doctors, and the defendant Rostock, who was the immediate subordinate of Karl Brandt, and the defendant Bloma, a medical official of the Nazi Party, and the defendant Foerschner, whom we have grouped under the SS for reasons which will appear later. I will deal first with the military side of the case. Hitler, as Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the German Armed Forces, exercised his authority through a staff called the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, better known by its German initials OKW, or Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. The chief of this staff, throughout the period with which this case will concern itself, was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. Under the OKW came the three supreme commands of the three branches of the Wehrmacht: the Navy, OKM, the Army, OKH, and the Air Force, OKL. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder was the commander-in-chief of the German Navy until 1943, when he was succeeded by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Prior to the outbreak of the war, the commander-in-chief of the German Army was Field Marshal von Brauchitsch. In December 1941, Brauchitsch was relieved, and Hitler himself took the position. Hermann Goering was the commander-in-chief of the German Air Force with the rank of Reichsmarschall until the very last month of the war. Its own medical service. For purposes of this case, the medical service of the Navy is not of much importance. During most of the war, the Defendant Harmloser was chief of the medical service of the German Army. In 1944, he was succeeded in this capacity by Dr. Walker. The chief of the medical service of the German Air Force through 1943 was Dr. Erich Hippel. From January 1944 until the end of the war, he was Lieutenant Schroeder. Subordinate to Lieutenant Schroeder are 7 other defendants from the air. The prosecution's case relating to those crimes alleged to have been committed in the name of medical or scientific research. The charges with respect to euthanasia and the slaughter of tubercular Poles obviously have no relation to research or experimentation, and will be dealt with later. What I will cover now comprehends all the experiments charged as war crimes in paragraph 6 of the indictment, and as crimes against humanity in paragraph 11. It covers also the murders committed for so-called anthropological purposes, which are charged as war crimes in paragraph 7, and as crimes against humanity in paragraph 12 of the indictment. Before taking up these experiments one by one, let us look at them as a whole. Are they a heterogeneous list of horrors, or is there a common denominator for the whole group? A sort of rough pattern is apparent on the face of the indictment. Experiments concerning high altitude, the effect of cold, and the potability of processed seawater have an obvious relation to aeronautical and naval combat and rescue problems. The mustard gas and phosphorus burn experiments, as well as those relating to the healing value of sulfanilamide for wounds, can be related to air raid and battlefield medical problems. Also, it is well known that malaria, epidemic jaundice, and typhus were among the principal diseases which had to be combated by the German armed forces and by German authorities in occupied countries. To some degree, the therapeutic pattern outlined above is undoubtedly a valid one, and explains why the Wehrmacht, and especially the German Air Force, was interested in and participated in these experiments. Fanatically bent upon conquest, and utterly ruthless as to the means or instruments to be used in achieving victory, and callous to the sufferings of people whom they regarded as inferior, the German militarists were willing to gather whatever scientific fruit these experiments might yield. But our proof will show that a quite different and even more sinister objective runs like a red thread through these hideous researches. We will show that in some instances, the true object of these experiments was not how to rescue or cure, but how to destroy and kill. The sterilization experiments were, it is clear, purely destructive in their purpose. And the prisoners at Buchenwald, who were shot with poison bullets, were not guinea pigs to test an antidote for poison. Their murderers really wanted to know how quickly the poison would kill. This destructive objective is not superficially as apparent in the other experiments, but we will show that it was often there. Mankind has not heretofore felt the need of a word to denominate the science of how most rapidly to kill prisoners and subjugated peoples in large numbers. This case and these defendants have created this gruesome question for the lexicographer. For the moment, we will christen this macabre science thanatology, the science of producing death. The thanatological knowledge, derived in part from these experiments, supplied the techniques for genocide, a policy of the Third Reich exemplified in the euthanasia program and in the widespread slaughter of Jews, Gypsies, Poles, and Russians. This policy of mass extermination could not have been so effectively carried out without the active participation of German medical scientists. I will now take up the experiments themselves. 2 or 3 of them I will describe rather fully, but most of them will be treated in summary fashion, as Mr. McHaney will be presenting detailed proof of each of them. The first are the high altitude experiments. Subparagraph A of paragraph 6 of the indictment. The experiments known as high altitude or low pressure experiments were carried out at the Dachau concentration camp in 1942. According to the proof, the original proposal that such experiments be carried out on human beings originated in the spring of 1941 with a Dr. Sigmund Förschner. This destructive objective is not superficially as apparent in the other experiments, but we will show that it was often there. Mankind has not heretofore felt the need of a word to denominate the science of how most rapidly to kill prisoners and subjugated peoples in large numbers. This case and these defendants have created this gruesome question for the lexicographer. For the moment, we will christen this macabre science thanatology, the science of producing death. The thanatological knowledge, derived in part from these experiments, supplied the techniques for genocide, a policy of the Third Reich exemplified in the euthanasia program and in the widespread slaughter of Jews, Gypsies, Poles, and Russians. This policy of mass extermination could not have been so effectively carried out without the active participation of German medical scientists. I will now take up the experiments themselves. 2 or 3 of them I will describe rather fully, but most of them will be treated in summary fashion, as Mr. McHaney will be presenting detailed proof of each of them. The first are the high altitude experiments. Subparagraph A of paragraph 6 of the indictment. The experiments known as high altitude or low pressure experiments were carried out at the Dachau concentration camp in 1942. According to the proof, the original proposal that such experiments be carried out on human beings originated in the spring of 1941 with a Dr. Sigmund Förschner. I was about to quote from a report written in May 1942 describing one of these high-altitude tests on a Jewish subject. I'll proceed with the quotation. Some of the experimental subjects died during a continued high-altitude experiment. For instance, after 1/2 hour at a height of 12 kilometers, after the skull had been opened underwater, an ample amount of air embolism was found in the brain vessels and, in part, free air in the brain ventricles. In order to find out whether the severe physical and psychical effects, as mentioned above, are due to the formation of embolism, the following was done. After relative recuperation from such a parachute descending test had taken place, however, before regaining consciousness, some experimental subjects were kept underwater until they died. When the skull and cavities of the breast and of the abdomen were opened underwater, an enormous amount of air embolism was found in the vessels of the brain, the coronary vessels, the vessels of the liver and the intestines. End of the quotation. The victims who did not die in the course of such experiments surely wished that they had. A long report written in July 1942 by Rascher and by the defendants Rupp and Romberg describes an experiment on a former delicatessen clerk who was given an oxygen mask and raised in the chamber to an atmospheric elevation of over 47,000 feet, at which point the mask was removed and a parachute descent was simulated. The report describes the victim's reactions: spasmodic convulsions, agonal convulsive breathing, chronic convulsions and groaning. The yells aloud, convulses arms and legs, grimaces, bites his tongue, does not respond to speech, gives the impression of someone who is completely out of his mind. The evidence which we will produce will establish that the defendants Rupp and Romberg personally participated with Rascher in experiments resulting in death and torture, that the defendant Sievers watched the experiments for an entire day and made an oral report to Himmler on his observations, that the defendant Rudolf Brandt was the agent of Himmler in providing the human subjects for these experiments and in making many other facilities available to Rascher and rendering him general assistance, and that the defendant Welz, in his official capacity, repeatedly insisted on supervision over and full responsibility and credit for the experiments. The higher authorities of both the German Air Force and the SS were fully informed concerning what was going on. Extensive correspondence will be introduced, for example, concerning the availability of the low-pressure chamber which the German Air Force furnished at Dachau, and concerning the availability of Rascher, who was an officer in the Air Force Medical Service, to conduct the experiments. Knowledge of, participation in, and responsibility for these atrocious crimes on the part of the defendants here charged will be clearly shown by the evidence. B. Freezing experiments. The deep interest of the German Air Force in capitalizing on the availability of inmates in concentration camps for experimental purposes is even more apparent in the case of the freezing experiments. These, too, were conducted at Dachau. They began immediately after the high-altitude experiments were completed, and they continued until the spring of 1943. Here again, the defendant Welz was directly in charge of the experiments with Rascher as his assistant, as is shown in a letter written in May 1942 by Field Marshal Erhard Milch, the Inspector General of the German Air Force, to SS-Oberscharführer Wolf, who is one of Heinrich Himmler's principal subordinates. And this letter specifically requested, on behalf of the German Air Force, that the freezing experiments be carried out at Dachau under Welz's supervision. The purpose of these experiments was to determine the most effective way of rewarming German aviators who were forced to parachute into the North Sea. The evidence will show that in the course of these experiments, the victims were forced to remain outdoors without clothing in freezing weather from 9 to 14 hours. In other cases, they were forced to remain in a tank of iced water for 3 hours at a time. The water experiments are described in a report by Rascher, written in August 1942. I quote, "Electrical measurements gave low temperature readings of 26.4 degrees in the stomach and 26.5 degrees in the rectum. Fatalities occurred only when the brainstem and the back of the head were also chilled. Autopsies of such fatal cases always revealed large amounts of free blood, up to half a liter, in the cranial cavity. The heart invariably showed extreme dilation of the right chamber. As soon as the temperature in these experiments reached 28 degrees, the experimental subjects died invariably, despite all attempts at resuscitation." Other documents set forth that from time to time the temperature of the water would be lowered by 10 degrees centigrade and a quart of blood would be taken from an artery in the subject's throat for analysis. The organs of the victims who died were extracted and sent to the Pathological Institute at Munich. Rewarming of the subjects was attempted by various means, most commonly and successfully in a very hot bath. In September, Himmler personally ordered that rewarming by the warmth of human bodies also be attempted. And the inhuman villains who conducted these experiments promptly produced 4 gypsy women from the Ravensbrück concentration camp. When the women had arrived, rewarming was attempted by placing the chilled victim between 2 naked women. A voluminous report on the freezing experiments conducted in tanks of iced water, written in October 1942, contains the following. If the experimental subjects were placed in the water under narcosis, one observed a certain rousing effect. The subject began to groan and made some defensive movements. In a few cases, a state of excitement developed. This was especially severe in the cooling of the head and neck, but never was a complete cessation of the narcosis observed. The defensive movements ceased after about 5 minutes. There followed a progressive rigor, which developed especially strongly in the arm musculature. The arms were strongly flexed and pressed to the body. The rigor increased with the continuation of the cooling.
Thank you for stopping by the War Den. This video ended up being over 3 hours long, so I've broken it up. If you'd like to continue watching part 4, click the link at the end. I put a ridiculous amount of time into researching and creating this content. If you learned anything from this video, please consider liking it and maybe even subscribing. Thanks again for visiting the War Den.